The crackle from the external speaker sharpened into a burst of clipped radio traffic that did not belong to the rhythm of a routine training launch. The crew chief inside the Seahawk turned his head slowly, one gloved hand pressing against his headset, as if he had misheard something important. Captain Brooks caught the shift in posture and felt a faint tightening in his chest. "Tower, say again," came the voice from the cockpit, filtered and metallic through the speaker. A pause followed, longer than it should have been. The turbines continued their steady whine, but the energy on the pad changed, subtle and electric. Hayes remained still, eyes on the control tower windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Brooks folded his arms across his chest, masking uncertainty with impatience. "You just made that up," he said, though the edge in his tone was no longer playful. "There is no such thing as Omega extraction protocol." Hayes did not look at him. "There was," he replied quietly. Up in the tower, Commander Blake Monroe had been reviewing departure sequencing when the open frequency carried a name he had not heard spoken aloud in over 20 years. He froze with one hand resting on the console. The air traffic specialist beside him glanced over. "Sir." Monroe did not answer immediately. He replayed the transmission in his headset, isolating the voice from the background rotor wash. "Hayes. Sabre Actual." The designation had not appeared in any current operations manual. It had not existed in any system since the early days of coordinated fleet extraction drills during the final years of the Cold War. But Monroe had studied those after-action reports at Annapolis. He knew who had led the prototype recovery missions when carrier groups operated without satellite redundancy, when pilots relied on instinct and timing measured in seconds. He stood so abruptly that his chair rolled back and struck the wall. "Hold all departures," he ordered, voice steady but tight. "Repeat. Hold all departures on pads 2 and 3. Down below, the Seahawk's engine pitch shifted. The blades continued to spin, but the acceleration toward launch halted. A yellow light flickered near the landing gear as the pilot acknowledged the instruction. Brooks stared up at the aircraft, confusion overtaking irritation. He stepped toward the crew chief. "What is going on?" The chief did not answer immediately. He was listening. "Captain," he said finally, lowering his voice. "Tower just requested confirmation of a designation." Brooks felt heat rise under his collar despite the wind. "It was a joke," he snapped. "Some retired sailor's story." Hayes turned then, meeting Brooks's gaze for the first time since speaking the words. There was no triumph in his expression, only a calm acceptance, as if he had expected this exact sequence of events. Across the pad, 2 additional helicopters that had been taxiing toward position reduced power. The sharp mechanical roar softened into a controlled hum. One by one, conversations ceased. The usual chaos of a working flight line thinned into an uneasy quiet layered over the persistent turbine whine. From the tower, Monroe's voice carried again over the frequency, clearer now, stripped of uncertainty. "Pad 3, confirm individual identified as Samuel Hayes." The crew chief swallowed. "Affirmative, Tower." Another pause, heavier this time. Even the wind seemed to hesitate between gusts. Brooks glanced at Hayes, then back at the helicopter, the weight of something larger settling onto the concrete around them. For the first time since approaching the old man, he was no longer certain who actually controlled the pad. The final turbine dropped from a rising whine to a steady idle, then to a controlled wind down that rolled across the pad like distant thunder fading into the horizon. One by one, the rotor blades slowed, chopping the air in heavy, deliberate arcs until the wind they created softened into a restless breeze. The sudden reduction in noise exposed smaller sounds that had been buried beneath the engines only seconds before. The rattle of loose tied-down chains against metal skids, the faint slap of a windsock shifting direction, the muted click of a headset being removed. Captain Brooks felt the vibration beneath his boots ease as the Seahawk settled into silence. It was not the kind of silence that followed a canceled drill or a weather delay. It was precise, intentional, ordered. Over the tower frequency, Commander Monroe's voice carried again, now stripped of any trace of doubt. "All flight operations on pads 2 and 3 are suspended until further notice. Maintain position." No one questioned the command. A junior pilot near the edge of the pad instinctively straightened his posture, as if responding to something older than regulation. Brooks turned slowly toward Samuel Hayes. The denim jacket no longer looked misplaced against the concrete and steel. It looked anchored there. "What did you just do?" Brooks asked, his voice lower now, no longer competing with engines. Hayes glanced at the silent helicopter beside them, then back toward the control tower windows reflecting the setting sun in sheets of orange light. "I did not do anything," he said evenly. "I only answered your question." Brooks felt the weight of every pair of eyes on the pad shift toward him, then toward the old man. The air smelled of cooling metal and fuel vapor. Heat shimmer still rose from the tarmac, but without the rotor wash it seemed to hang in place, suspended. In the tower, Monroe removed his headset and reached for a secured line mounted beneath the console. His hand hesitated for less than a second before pressing the button. The call did not go to operations scheduling. It did not go to maintenance. It went directly to Fleet Command Liaison, the number rarely used and never dialed lightly. "This is Commander Monroe," he said, voice steady. "We have confirmation. Samuel Hayes is physically present on Pad 3. A long pause followed. Monroe listened, posture rigid. "Yes, sir," he replied quietly. He identified himself as Saber Actual. Down below, Brooks swallowed. The title echoed in his mind now with a resonance that no longer sounded theatrical. The crew chief stepped closer to Hayes, removing his gloves, his expression no longer skeptical but measured. "Sir," he said respectfully, "were you attached to 7th Fleet recovery exercises in 1979? Hayes nodded once. The movement was small, almost weary. "We tested extraction windows measured in less than 90 seconds, he said, before satellite guidance stabilized. A ripple moved through the small group of aviators. Some had studied those early doctrine revisions in flight school, case studies cited but never personalized. Brooks felt something shift inside him, a recalibration. Authority on a pad was supposed to be clear, defined by ranks stitched on a collar. But rank did not make the turbine stop. Rank did not freeze a launch sequence mid-power. Across the base, a black command sport utility vehicle turned off the main access road and accelerated toward the flight line, its headlights catching the last light of day as it approached the silent row of helicopters waiting under a sky that suddenly felt very still. The black command sport utility vehicle rolled onto the edge of the flight line without sirens, without flashing lights, but every head turned toward it as if drawn by gravity. Its tires crunched over loose gravel before easing onto the concrete of Pad 3, stopping just short of the painted safety boundary. The engine shut off immediately. The driver stepped out first, scanning the silent row of helicopters with measured focus. Then the rear passenger door opened, and Vice Admiral Richard Cole emerged in full service khakis, cover tucked beneath his arm, ribbons aligned in disciplined rows across his chest. He did not rush. He did not look around for orientation. His eyes were already locked on the solitary figure standing beside the Seahawk. Captain Brooks felt his pulse thud in his ears as the Admiral crossed the distance between the vehicle and the pad. No one had ordered the aviators to stand at attention, yet they did. The movement was subtle but unified, boots drawing together, shoulders straightening, hands settling at their sides. The last rotor blade on the nearest helicopter came to a complete stop, its final rotation clicking softly as it aligned with the tail boom. The pad was now entirely still. Admiral Cole stepped over the painted line and stopped 3 feet in front of Samuel Hayes. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The evening light cast long shadows behind them, stretching toward the hangars like silent witnesses. Captain Brooks had seen the Admiral in briefings, in inspections, in formal ceremonies. He had never seen his expression like this. It was not anger. It was not ceremony. It was recognition. "Saber Actual," Cole said quietly, the title carrying across the quiet concrete with more force than a shouted command. Hayes met his gaze without surprise. "It has been a while, sir," he replied. The Admiral's jaw tightened slightly, as if containing emotion that did not belong on a flight line. "You were not scheduled to be here," Cole said, though the statement carried no accusation. Hayes glanced at the Seahawk. "I was in the area," he answered simply. "I wanted to see if they still launch within the window." A faint breath of wind moved across the pad, lifting the edge of his jacket. Cole nodded once, understanding layered into the gesture. He stepped back half a pace, then brought his right hand sharply to his brow in a salute so precise it seemed to cut the air. The motion was mirrored instinctively by every aviator within sight, including Captain Brooks, whose arm snapped upward before he consciously registered the decision. The crisp sound of fabric shifting and boots adjusting echoed across the silent helipad. Hayes hesitated for a fraction of a second, then returned the salute, his movement slower but steady, practiced by decades rather than rehearsed for display. Brooks felt a tightening in his throat he did not expect. The authority he had relied on minutes earlier now felt narrow compared to the weight of history standing in front of him. Admiral Cole lowered his hand, but did not break eye contact with Hayes. "We still teach your extraction window," he said. 90 seconds from call to lift. Hayes gave a faint nod. "It was never about the seconds," he replied. "It was about who you brought home." The words settled over the pad heavier than the rotor wash had earlier. Captain Brooks lowered his salute slowly, understanding dawning with uncomfortable clarity that respect was not commanded by volume or position. It was earned in moments that never made headlines, in protocols written before he had ever worn a uniform. The helicopters waited in disciplined silence beneath a sky turning deep orange, as if even the machines understood that something older than rank had just taken the lead. For several seconds after the salute, no one moved. The evening air settled over the helipad like a held breath. Vice Admiral Cole lowered his hand and studied Samuel Hayes with a quiet intensity that erased the decades between rank and retirement. Around them, young aviators stood in disciplined stillness, the weight of what they had just witnessed pressing against their understanding of service. Captain Ethan Brooks felt the stiffness in his shoulders soften into something closer to humility. The patch on Hayes's jacket no longer looked faded. It looked earned. Admiral Cole glanced briefly toward the silent line of helicopters, then back to Hayes. "We revised the protocol in 1992, he said, voice steady but respectful. "We added redundancy, satellite alignment, thermal sweep confirmation." Hayes gave a faint nod. "Redundancy is useful," he replied. "But judgment still matters more." The words were not spoken as criticism. They were spoken as fact. Brooks felt them land squarely in his chest. He had built his confidence on checklists, simulations, and flawless inspections. Yet none of those had stopped the turbines. None of them had commanded a 4-star admiral to drive across base without warning. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, eyes tracing the length of the Seahawk's fuselage, as if remembering a shape he once knew in darkness and fog. "Do they still practice night extractions without digital overlay?" he asked quietly. Admiral Cole allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. "Once a quarter," he answered. "Instructors say it keeps them honest." Hayes looked toward the young pilots, who now stood straighter under his gaze than they ever had during a formal review. "Good," he said. "Machines fail. Instinct does not." The simplicity of the statement carried no arrogance. It carried memory. Brooks stepped forward at last, removing his cover, his voice measured. "Sir," he said, directing the word to Hayes rather than the admiral, "I owe you an apology." The admission felt heavier than any reprimand he had ever delivered. Hayes turned toward him fully, studying the captain's face with the same steady calm he had shown from the beginning. "You were protecting your pad," Hayes replied. "That is your duty." Brooks swallowed. "I should have listened before I spoke." Hayes considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Listening is also a duty." The words did not sting. They instructed. Admiral Cole stepped slightly aside, giving the two men space, though the entire flight line remained attentive. "Captain Brooks," the admiral said evenly, "resume operations when ready." It was not a command delivered with urgency. It was trust returned to its rightful place. Brooks nodded, drawing a slow breath of cooling air scented with fuel and salt from the distant harbor. He signaled to the crew chief, who moved with renewed precision. One by one, helmets were secured. Headsets slipped back into place. The turbines began to turn again, slowly at first, then with gathering strength. This time the sound felt different, less chaotic, more deliberate. Hayes stepped back beyond the painted line without being asked, hands resting loosely at his sides. As the first helicopter lifted gently into the deepening orange sky, rotor wash rippling across the pad, Brooks caught a final glimpse of the old man standing steady against the wind. The aircraft climbed within the 90-second window, smooth and exact. And for the first time since earning his command, Captain Ethan Brooks understood that respect was not granted by ranks stitched on a collar. It was recognized in silence, in stillness, and in the steady voice of a man who never needed to raise it. The Seahawk climbed past 200 feet, banking gently toward open water as the late sun burned low over the harbor, turning the fuselage into a silhouette of steel and discipline. The rotor wash rolled across the pad one last time before thinning into the wider sky. Captain Ethan Brooks watched the aircraft until it cleared the airspace perimeter, his headset pressed tight against his ear, voice steady as he confirmed the 90-second mark with the tower. "Launch complete within window," he reported, hearing the subtle shift in Commander Blake Monroe's reply. "Copy that," Monroe answered, the words carrying something unspoken behind them. Vice Admiral Richard Cole remained beside Samuel Hayes, both men standing just beyond the painted safety line as the remaining helicopters prepared to follow. The base resumed motion, but it did so differently now. Every movement seemed more deliberate. Every checklist item was spoken with sharper clarity. Hayes observed without comment, pale blue eyes tracking the choreography of crews and machines with quiet approval. Brooks stepped away from the launch line and approached him once more, removing his headset entirely this time. Without the engines dominating the air, smaller sounds returned. Gulls circling above the waterfront, the distant clang of a halyard against a mast, the low murmur of technicians exchanging data. "Sir," Brooks said carefully, "would you be willing to address the squadron tomorrow morning?" The request was not casual. It was offered with genuine intent. Hayes studied him for a long moment, then glanced at Admiral Cole, who gave the slightest nod. "I do not lecture," Hayes replied, "but I can answer questions." Brooks allowed himself a faint smile. That would be enough. A second helicopter spooled up behind them, blades gathering speed in controlled rotation. Hayes looked toward the tower again, his expression softening as if remembering a different skyline, a different era when radar returns were faint and margins were narrow. "You build confidence in calm weather," he said quietly, "but you discover character when the signal fades." Brooks absorbed the words without interruption. They did not sound like a warning. They sounded like inheritance. Admiral Cole checked his watch, then turned toward Hayes. "I will have transportation." "Arranged," he offered. Hayes shook his head gently. "I drove myself," he said. "I still trust my own timing." The Admiral almost laughed, but the sound remained contained, respectful. Another launch clearance echoed from the tower. Engines surged. The next Seahawk lifted cleanly off the pad, nose rising with measured precision before leveling into forward flight. Brooks watched it disappear beyond the shoreline, then looked back at the man who had once defined the very window they were now measuring. "We still bring them home," Brooks said, more statement than question. Hayes met his gaze and nodded once. "That is what matters." The wind picked up again as the last helicopter prepared to depart, brushing against Hayes's jacket and lifting the faded patch that had nearly gone unnoticed an hour earlier. It no longer seemed worn. It seemed permanent. As the final aircraft cleared the pad and the evening settled fully into amber and shadow, Brooks understood something that no manual had ever printed. Authority may control the schedule, but legacy commands the silence. And on that helipad, under a sky turning deep navy blue, silence had spoken louder than any order ever could. By the time the last helicopter cleared the coastline and its sound dissolved into the distance, the sky above the base had turned a deep shade of navy, the first evening stars beginning to pierce through the fading light. The flight line lights flickered on one by one, casting long white beams across the concrete pads. Samuel Hayes stood quietly near the edge of Pad 3, hands resting at his sides, watching the empty air where the aircraft had disappeared. Captain Ethan Brooks approached again, this time without urgency, without the sharp edge that had defined him earlier in the day. The hum of generators and distant shoreline traffic replaced the thunder that had once dominated the space. Vice Admiral Richard Cole checked a message on his secure device, then looked up toward Hayes. "We will prepare a small gathering in the briefing room," the Admiral said. "Nothing formal, just the squadron." Hayes considered the suggestion, eyes moving briefly toward the hangars where young aviators were already talking in quieter tones than usual. "If they come with questions, I will stay," he replied. Brooks felt a quiet sense of responsibility settle into him, different from command authority. This felt personal. "They will come," he said with certainty. A maintenance truck rolled slowly across the far end of the tarmac, headlights cutting through the dimness. The routine of the base resumed, but it carried a subtle shift in energy, as though the events of the afternoon had recalibrated something unseen. Hayes took a slow breath, the scent of ocean air mixing with fuel and warm concrete. "You run a disciplined pad," he said to Brooks. The words were simple, yet Brooks recognized them as approval. "We try to," he answered. Hayes gave a faint nod. "Discipline keeps the machine steady," he said. "Humility keeps the pilot steady." The lesson was not delivered as correction. It was offered like a compass bearing. Brooks absorbed it without defensiveness. Admiral Cole stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "The fleet remembers," he said to Hayes. "But memory fades without witnesses." Hayes looked toward the darkened horizon where sea met sky. "Then let them witness," he replied. A gust of wind moved across the pad, lifting loose dust in a brief swirl before settling again. Brooks glanced at the tower, where Commander Blake Monroe remained at his post, silhouetted against glowing screens. The chain of command had acted swiftly, not because of rank, but because of recognition. That realization settled deeply within him. A young ensign approached hesitantly from the edge of the hangar, helmet tucked under his arm. He stopped several feet away from Hayes, posture straight but uncertain. "Sir," the ensign said respectfully, "were you really the one who set the 90-second window?" Hayes met the young pilot's gaze with steady calm. "No," he replied. "We set it together." The answer carried more weight than any legend could have. The ensign nodded, absorbing the simplicity of it. The night deepened, and the lights of the base shimmered against the dark water beyond. Brooks stood there longer than necessary, aware that the afternoon had altered something fundamental in his understanding of command. As Samuel Hayes turned toward the parking lot where his own vehicle waited under a lone light pole, Brooks realized that the silence earlier had not been a disruption. It had been a reminder. Machines obey authority. Men remember legacy. And on that quiet helipad, legacy had spoken first. The parking lot lights cast long pale circles across the asphalt as Samuel Hayes walked slowly toward his truck, the evening air cooler now, carrying the steady rhythm of waves against the distant pier. Captain Ethan Brooks remained a few steps behind him, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to respect. Vice Admiral Richard Cole had already returned to his vehicle, leaving the flight line under the quiet supervision of Commander Blake Monroe. The base had settled into its night cadence, radios lower, engines silent, boots softer on concrete. Hayes paused beside an older pickup parked beneath a flickering light. The paint was worn but clean, the chrome dulled by years rather than neglect. He rested one hand briefly on the hood, as if grounding himself before turning back toward Brooks. "You will have questions tomorrow," Hayes said calmly. Brooks nodded. "We already do." Hayes studied him for a moment, eyes steady but not severe. "Make sure they ask the right ones," he replied. Brooks considered that carefully. "Which ones are right?" Hayes glanced back toward the darkened helipad, where faint silhouettes of helicopters stood lined in patient formation. "Not how fast," he said. "Not how high. Ask who you are responsible for when the signal disappears." The words lingered in the quiet space between them. Brooks felt again that subtle shift inside his chest, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but remains long after noise fades. A pair of junior aviators crossed the lot several yards away, slowing as they recognized Hayes. One of them gave a respectful nod. Hayes returned it without ceremony. There was no desire for attention in him, no appetite for retelling, only a quiet acceptance of the moment. Brooks cleared his throat. "Sir, why did you really come here today?" Hayes opened the driver's side door, but did not get in immediately. He looked past Brooks, toward the runway lights stretching into the distance. "Because timing changes," he said. "But responsibility does not." Brooks absorbed that in silence. Hayes continued, voice low and even. "When we wrote that window, we did not measure seconds to prove speed. We measured them to prove commitment. If a crew says they are coming, they arrive. That is what 90 seconds means." Brooks nodded slowly. The lesson felt less like instruction and more like inheritance being handed forward. In the distance, the tower beacon rotated, sweeping white light across the night sky in steady intervals. Hayes finally settled into the driver's seat and closed the door gently. He rolled the window down, once more before starting the engine. "Captain," he said, and the use of the title carried no irony now. Do not let volume define authority. Brooks met his gaze. Yes, sir. Hayes gave a small nod, then started the truck. The engine turned over smoothly, headlights cutting a narrow path through the lot as he eased toward the exit gate. Brooks stood still until the vehicle disappeared beyond the security fence, red tail lights fading into the quiet road beyond the base. Behind him, the helicopters remained motionless, lined in discipline beneath the deep Navy sky. For the first time since earning his command, Captain Ethan Brooks understood that silence was not emptiness. It was presence. And earlier that day, on a sunlit pad shaken by rotor wash, presence had spoken without ever raising its voice. The base did not sleep the way cities did. It shifted into a quieter rhythm, lights glowing steady along the perimeter fence, security vehicles rolling slow patrols beneath a sky brushed with distant stars. Captain Ethan Brooks remained on the edge of Pad 3 long after Samuel Hayes's truck had disappeared beyond the gate. The concrete still held warmth from the day, but the air had cooled enough to carry the scent of salt from the harbor. He removed his gloves and tucked them beneath his arm, looking out over the silent row of helicopters aligned with careful precision. Earlier, he had stood here convinced that authority meant command presence and volume. Now the memory felt thin. Commander Blake Monroe's voice came through the portable radio clipped at Brooks's shoulder. Captain, debrief in 10 minutes. The tone was routine, but Brooks heard the underlying acknowledgement. On my way, he replied, voice steady. As he walked toward the operations building, he passed small groups of aviators gathered in low conversation. No one was laughing loudly. No one was careless with their words. The story had already begun to travel across the base, not as rumor, but as lesson. Inside the briefing room, fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Flight charts were spread across the main table, and a digital timer on the wall still displayed the recorded launch window from earlier that evening. 90 seconds. Brooks paused at the doorway, studying the number as if seeing it for the first time. It was no longer just a metric. It was a promise. Monroe stood near the front of the room, arms folded loosely. When Brooks entered, the commander gave a small nod that required no explanation. You handled the restart well, Monroe said. Brooks shook his head slightly. I handled it late, he answered. Monroe allowed a faint smile. Better late than never. The room began to fill with pilots and crew chiefs, helmets set carefully on the table, chairs sliding quietly into place. There was no formal agenda posted on the board, only a blank space waiting to be written on. Brooks moved to the center of the room, resting both hands lightly against the table's edge. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture. Tomorrow morning, he began, we will review extraction protocol. Several aviators exchanged brief glances. Brooks continued, not the technology, not the systems, the responsibility. The words felt different leaving his mouth now. They felt anchored. A young lieutenant near the back of the room raised a tentative hand. Sir, was it really him? Brooks held the lieutenant's gaze. Yes, he said simply. Silence followed, but it was not disbelief. It was reflection. Brooks glanced again at the digital timer on the wall. 90 seconds. He understood now that the number measured more than response time. It measured trust. Outside, the tower beacon continued its steady rotation, sweeping light across runway and water alike. Somewhere beyond the fence line, Samuel Hayes was driving home through quiet coastal roads, unseen and unannounced. Yet his presence remained on that base more firmly than any order Brooks had given all year. And as the squadron settled into their seats, waiting to listen rather than to speak, Captain Ethan Brooks realized that command did not begin when engines start. It begins when pride stops. The briefing room remained quiet long after Captain Ethan Brooks finished speaking. No one reached for their phones. No one shifted impatiently in their seats. The digital timer on the wall still displayed 90 seconds, glowing red against the whiteboard as if it were a reminder rather than a measurement. Commander Blake Monroe stepped forward, resting one hand on the back of a chair. Tomorrow, he said calmly, we will run a no-overlay drill. A subtle ripple moved through the room. No satellite alignment. No advanced guidance prompts. Just pilot judgment and crew coordination. Brooks nodded once. Full crew participation, he added. Every seat accountable. The aviators absorbed. The instruction without complaint. Something had changed. The confidence in the room felt quieter, less about proving skill and more about honoring responsibility. Outside, the base settled deeper into night. Runway lights extended like a path into darkness, and the control tower windows reflected the steady rotation of the beacon. In his office, Brooks stood alone for a moment, jacket draped over the back of his chair. He looked down at the embroidered wings on his chest and thought about how easily pride can disguise itself as certainty. Earlier that afternoon, he had believed he was protecting procedure. Now he understood he had nearly overlooked legacy. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. It was the young lieutenant who had asked the question during the briefing. "Sir," the lieutenant said respectfully, "if the signal does disappear one day, how do we know we are ready?" Brooks considered the question carefully. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced once more at the timer through the open doorway. "You are ready," he said finally, "when you stop thinking about yourself first." The lieutenant nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that. "Yes, sir." As the officer left, Brooks stepped toward the window overlooking the flight line. The helicopters stood motionless under the floodlights, silhouettes against the dark water beyond the fence. He imagined Samuel Hayes driving along a quiet coastal highway, headlights cutting through miles of open road, unaware that his brief visit had already reshaped the squadron. Not through reprimand, not through rank, through presence. The following morning arrived cool and clear. Dawn painted the horizon in pale orange streaks as aviators assembled on the pad earlier than scheduled. No one needed to be reminded. Checklists were spoken with precision. Eye contact lingered a moment longer between pilot and crew chief. When the first helicopter powered up, Brooks stood near the edge of the pad, not commanding, but observing. The countdown began quietly. 10 seconds. 5. The aircraft lifted smoothly within the window, banking toward the water without hesitation. Brooks did not look at the timer this time. He looked at the faces around him. Focused, calm, responsible. Commander Monroe stepped beside him. "Window held," he said simply. Brooks nodded. "It always did," he replied. Above them, the helicopter climbed into open sky, steady against the morning light. The sound of the rotors no longer felt like noise. It felt like promise. And as the squadron continued their launches, each one measured not just in seconds, but in commitment, Captain Ethan Brooks understood something permanent. Technology advances. Protocol evolves. But the standard remains. Some voices do not need to be loud to change a command. Some names do not echo. They steady the air itself. The morning after the first successful launch window, the base was already humming with its usual routine. The sun had barely risen, but the flight line was alive with activity. Technicians moving between helicopters, prepping for the next mission. Captain Ethan Brooks stood at the edge of the pad, watching the crew go about their work with a quiet confidence that had settled into him over the past 24 hours. The sharpness he had once felt when making decisions now felt tempered with understanding. It wasn't that he had changed overnight. It was that he had learned to see more clearly what true leadership required. As the first helicopter in the queue powered up, its rotors spinning into life, Brooks felt the familiar hum of excitement in the air, but there was something different about this launch. This time, no one was looking at the clock. The focus wasn't on the seconds ticking away, but on the smooth operation of every movement around them. It was the kind of precision that could only be achieved when every person in the squadron knew their responsibility and trusted each other to execute it. Commander Blake Monroe approached Brooks from behind, the sound of his boots steady on the concrete. "The crew's holding it together," Monroe said, his tone casual but with an underlying respect. "Better than expected, given the circumstances." Brooks nodded. "It's not about what we expected. It's about what we're prepared for." Monroe glanced at the helicopter as it lifted off the pad, its powerful engines roaring against the early morning stillness. "Seems like they're all prepared, sir." Brooks couldn't help but agree. The base had settled into a rhythm that had felt elusive just days before. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And for the first time since taking command, he felt that the squadron was moving forward with the kind of clarity he had been searching for. As the day unfolded, the launches continued, each one timed precisely within the window, each one executed with careful coordination between pilots, crew chiefs, and the technicians. On the ground, there were no more doubts about their capabilities. The team had risen to the challenge and surpassed even their own expectations. Brooks stood near the flight line, watching as the last helicopter of the morning took off. His eyes followed it until it disappeared into the sky, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle back onto his shoulders. This was what it meant to lead. Not to command from a distance, but to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who carried out the mission, to know that every decision made was one that would ripple through the entire team. He took a deep breath, savoring the moment of peace before the next wave of operations began. For the first time in a long while, Captain Ethan Brooks felt certain that the squadron was ready for whatever came next. As the hum of the base continued around him, he understood that it wasn't about the technology or the procedure. It was about the people, and that was what would carry them through, no matter the challenge. The following morning, the sun had risen over the base, casting a pale glow across the flight line as the first signs of morning activity began. It had been a week since the squadron had executed its first drill under the new leadership, and Captain Ethan Brooks found himself walking the tarmac with a sense of quiet anticipation. The familiar hum of preparation filled the air as crew chiefs and technicians moved between the helicopters, running final checks before the first scheduled flight. Brooks paused at the edge of the pad, watching as one of the pilots performed a final inspection of the helicopter's landing gear. The rhythm of the operation felt natural now, seamless. The urgency that had once been present, the tension and the unspoken fear of failure, had dissipated into something more grounded. The squadron was no longer struggling to meet expectations. They were exceeding them. As the first helicopter powered up, Brooks watched the crew chief signal the pilot to begin taxiing. It was a simple moment, but it carried a weight that had not been there before. The noise of the helicopter's engines filled the space, but it didn't drown out the quiet pride that Brooks felt watching the team work together so fluidly. There was no hesitation now, no uncertainty. They were all moving as one, with purpose and precision. Commander Blake Monroe approached, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Impressive, sir," he said, his tone light, but with a note of genuine respect. Brooks nodded, his eyes following the helicopter as it lifted off the pad. "It's not just me," he replied. "It's all of them." Monroe followed Brooks's gaze as the helicopter climbed into the sky, disappearing into the distance. "They've come a long way in a short time," Monroe agreed. "We've all learned something," Brooks said quietly. "About leadership, about responsibility, about trust." Monroe turned to face him. "And what about you, sir? What have you learned?" Brooks took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question settle in his chest. "That it's not about being in charge," he said finally. "It's about knowing when to step back and let others lead." Monroe gave him a thoughtful look before nodding. "That's the kind of leadership that makes a difference," he said. As the day progressed, the squadron continued to operate with the same precision, each launch timed perfectly, each maneuver executed without flaw. The confidence that had once been absent was now palpable, not just in the air but on the ground as well. Brooks watched as the crew worked together, communicating silently and with purpose. There was no longer a need for constant oversight. The team had found its rhythm, and Brooks knew that they had earned it. Later that afternoon, the base commander called for a debrief. As Brooks entered the room, he noticed the shift in the room's atmosphere. It wasn't just about the performance of the flight. It was about the growth of the team. The respect that had been built over the past week was evident in every person in that room. They were no longer just a squadron. They were a unit. And as the debrief concluded, Brooks stood at the front of the room, watching as the team filed out, their heads held a little higher, their steps a little surer. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride wash over him. Not for himself, but for them. They had come together in a way that he had only hoped for when he first took command. As he left the room and walked back to his office, he paused for a moment, looking out over the flight line. The helicopters were parked in perfect alignment, waiting for the next mission, ready to take on whatever challenge lay ahead. And for the first time in his career, Brooks felt ready, too. Weeks passed, and the rhythm on base continued, steady as the movement of the tides beyond the shoreline. Captain Ethan Brooks found himself looking out at the flight line more often now, his mind quieter than it had ever been. The squadron had become more than just a unit of pilots and crew chiefs. They had become a cohesive force, each person aware of the role they played, each one trusting the others to perform their duties with precision and respect. It was the kind of environment that fostered growth, not through force, but through understanding. On the pad, the helicopters waited like sentinels, their engines humming softly in the background as technicians moved between them, running final checks. Brooks stood at the edge of the tarmac, the cool morning air brushing against his face as he watched his team prepare for another round of flights. The familiar hum of engines, the chatter over radios, the steady pace of operations, it was all in perfect harmony now. But even in the midst of the calm, Brooks couldn't ignore the subtle shift in his own perspective. He had learned something in the weeks since Samuel Hayes had come to the base, something deeper than just the mechanics of leadership. It was about trust. It was about stepping back when necessary and allowing others to take charge. The helicopters began to take off one by one, each pilot lifting into the sky with the same quiet confidence that had settled over the base. Brooks watched them, not as a commander, but as part of something much bigger. He felt the weight of responsibility, but it no longer felt burdensome. It felt like purpose. Later that day, as the sun began to set and the base started to quiet down, Commander Blake Monroe approached Brooks in the operations center. "It's been a good run," Monroe said, his tone casual but with an underlying respect. "They've come a long way." Brooks nodded, looking out the window at the flight line. "It's not just the flights," he said quietly. "It's the way they've learned to trust each other. That's the real success." Monroe leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "You've got them all looking to you," he said, "but you've also got them looking at each other." Brooks thought about that for a moment. He had spent so much of his career focused on being the one who led, the one who made the decisions. But now, he saw that leadership was about more than just making the right calls. It was about empowering others to make their own decisions and trusting them to act with the same responsibility and care that he expected from himself. As the last helicopter of the day touched down, its rotors slowing to a halt, Brooks felt a sense of satisfaction settle in his chest. This was what it meant to lead. Not through force, but through guidance. Not through control, but through trust. The squadron was ready, not because of him, but because of them. And for the first time in his career, Captain Ethan Brooks knew that leadership was not about having all the answers. It was about creating an environment where others could find their own answers, and in doing so, make the team stronger as a whole.